The most dangerous moment for any football team is not when they lose a player to injury, it is when they lose a player and the system does not know how to compensate, when the entire structure shifts, not because the tactics change, but because one specific absence reveals exactly how the tactics were working in the first place. That is the situation Arsenal are navigating right now, and understanding it properly changes how you see this entire squad, its strengths, its limits, and what Mikel Arteta actually needs to solve before this season ends. Let us start with what the surface picture shows and then take it apart. Martin Odegaard has been absent. Arsenal have dropped 6 points across 3 matches without him. The obvious reading of that is simple. Arsenal missed their best player. Replace him, get the points back. But that reading misses the more important question, because Arsenal did not simply perform at a lower level without Odegaard. They performed in a structurally different way. And the difference was not just about quality, it was about the geometry of how this team attacks and defends. If you watch those 3 matches carefully, what you would have noticed is not chaotic football. Arsenal still moved the ball with purpose, players still made correct individual decisions in isolation, but the connecting tissue between the phases, the moment where build-up becomes penetration, was consistently missing. That connecting tissue has a name, and it is not just Martin Odegaard, the individual, it is the specific spatial role he performs, a role that this squad, despite its depth, has not yet found a way to replicate with the same reliability. That is what we need to understand today. Arsenal's offensive system, at its most effective, operates on a principle of controlled chaos. The team creates situations where the opposition faces multiple simultaneous threats and cannot fully address all of them at the same time. To do this consistently, Arsenal depend on what you might call layered pressure, attacking from 3 distinct zones at once. Width from Saka on the right, depth from the overlapping fullback, and centrally, a player who can receive between the lines, face forward, and deliver a decision quickly that exploits whichever defensive gap the other 2 have created. That third layer is Odegaard's role, and it is more technically demanding than it appears. Receiving between the lines in a compact defensive block is not a passive action. The player must arrive at the right moment, not too early, which gives defenders time to track, and not too late, which allows the passing lane to close. They must receive under pressure with their body already oriented toward the next action. And they must make their decision, pass, turn, recycle within approximately 1 to 2 seconds before the press collapses. Odegaard does all of this at a level of consistency that very few players in world football can match. His positional timing is exceptional. His first touch under pressure is reliable. His decision-making speed in tight space is what makes the third layer of Arsenal's attack function as a genuine threat rather than an option that can be safely ignored. Though now here is the structural consequence of removing that. When the third layer is absent or present but less precise, the opposition's defensive block faces only 2 threats simultaneously instead of 3. Width and depth without the central penetrator, that is a much more manageable defensive problem. The block can stay compact, the fullback's run arrives in space but with no inside option to combine with. Saka receives wide but without the central option, dragging defenders out of shape. Arsenal's attack still moves, but it no longer threatens in the same way. Kaya and the opposition knows it. They can defend Arsenal's width without the anxiety of a central player arriving into the gap behind them. 6 points dropped. The data confirms the structural impact precisely, but here is the detail that most people have not examined closely enough. It is not just what Arsenal lose in attack without Odegaard. It is where the system loses its structure first, and that location reveals something important about how this team is actually built. The first point of structural breakdown without Odegaard is not in the final third, it is in the transition out of the defensive phase. Arsenal's pressing system, which is among the most coordinated in European football, requires a clear reference point at the top of the structure. A player whose positioning and movement communicates to the rest of the team when to press, where to press, and which passing lane to block first. Odegaard functions as that reference point on Arsenal's right side. His positioning in the press sets the angle that forces opposition ball carriers into predetermined areas. When he closes the left-sided centre-back, for example, the entire team's shape rotates in response. The central midfielder shifts to block the central pass. Saka tucks in to cover the wide option, and the press becomes a coordinated trap rather than a collection of individual efforts. Remove him, the reference point changes. The player who occupies his position in the press must replicate those angles and those triggers with the same timing and the same spatial understanding. If they do not, and even small differences in body shape or movement pattern affect this, the press becomes fractionally less coordinated. gaps appear, the opposition passes through the first line more comfortably, Arsenal's defensive structure is forced deeper. These are the invisible consequences of structural dependency. They do not always show up in shots conceded or goals scored, but they accumulate across 90 minutes as repeated small degradations of the system's intended function. If this level of structural analysis helps you see Arsenal and football in a different way, consider subscribing. This channel is built on one principle: clarity over noise. The FA Cup final against Manchester City gave us a live demonstration of something that goes beyond just Odegaard's absence, and it is worth examining separately because it reveals a second structural vulnerability. Eberechi Eze was also unavailable for that match, and that combination, Odegaard and Eze both absent simultaneously, is analytically significant in a way that extends beyond the immediate result. Eze's role in Arsenal's system provides something different from Odegaard, but equally important. Where Odegaard operates primarily in the half space on the right, providing timing and decision-making precision in advanced zones, Eze offers a different creative profile, one built on close-quarter skill, unpredictability, and the ability to change the game's tempo through individual action in tight space. These are complementary qualities. Odegaard provides structural creativity, output that emerges from the system functioning correctly. Eze provides disruptive creativity, output that can emerge even when the system is under pressure, when the structure has broken down, when Arsenal needs something individual rather than collective. When both are absent, the team loses both dimensions simultaneously. The system cannot create through structure because the structural reference point is gone, and the team cannot create through individual disruption because the player most capable of that is also unavailable. The result, which the original reporting described as a lack of control and technical ability against Manchester City, was therefore not simply a performance problem. It was a design exposure, a moment where the squad's depth behind its two primary creative players was tested at the highest level, in the highest stakes environment, and found insufficient for the task. That is not a criticism of the players who filled those roles. It is a structural observation, and structural observations are the ones that matter for what Arsenal do next. Norway manager Ståle Solbakken has confirmed, speaking to Dagbladet, that Odegaard's return to squad involvement is within reach, with the FA Cup fixture against Southampton identified as the target. The timeline he referenced was approximately 2.5 to 3 weeks. The club's decision-making around this return is worth examining in detail because it reflects a set of priorities that tells you something about how Arteta's staff think about player management. Odegaard was deliberately not rushed back for the FA Cup final. Despite the importance of that fixture, the decision was made to protect the rehabilitation process to ensure that when Odegaard returns, he returns with the structural foundation necessary to contribute fully across the remainder of the season, rather than returning at 60 or 70% and risking a further setback. That calculation involves at least 3 simultaneous considerations. First, the knee. This is an aggravation of an existing issue originally sustained against Brentford and worsened in the North London derby. A re-aggravation carries different risk than an initial injury. The tissue has already been stressed, the recovery pathway is less predictable, and another setback could be significantly more serious in terms of duration and long-term structural damage. Second, the run-in. Arsenal are competing across multiple competitions in the final weeks of the season. The player returning at partial fitness who then breaks down again is not just a short-term loss, it is a psychological and structural disruption to a squad that is building momentum. Third, and this is the factor that changes the picture slightly, the World Cup. Odegaard joined Norway in November when they qualified for the summer tournament, reportedly declining a break in order to be with his teammates during the qualification campaign. That decision communicates something about the player's values and commitments. It also means that the World Cup is a clear personal objective, and that Odegaard's motivation to return in the best possible physical condition extends beyond Arsenal's season. For Arteta's staff, this creates an aligned interest. Odegaard wants to be physically ready for a World Cup. Arsenal want a fully functional Odegaard for the run-in. The rehabilitation pathway serves both goals simultaneously, which means both the player and the club have maximum incentive to get this return right rather than fast. The Southampton fixture as a return target reflects that logic precisely. It is a realistic reintegration match, competitive football, but not the most intense defensive or physical environment that allows Odegaard to rebuild rhythm, test the knee under match conditions, and reconnect with Arsenal's system timing before the most demanding fixtures of the season arrive. At the training ground this fortnight, Arsenal have a concentrated group of key players working together without the distractions or fatigue of international duty. Gabriel, Trossard, Saliba, Timber, Eze and Odegaard all present, all preparing. That is an unusual and potentially significant advantage as the season enters its critical phase. International players returning from duty, often fatigued, sometimes carrying niggles, always needing time to readjust to club rhythms, will need 1 to 2 weeks to recover full sharpness. Arsenal's core group will have had 3 weeks of consistent focused preparation. If the rehabilitation programme runs to plan, Arsenal could enter the decisive run of fixtures with something they have not had for several weeks: the full structural version of Mikel Arteta's system, with all its primary components available and in rhythm simultaneously. The questions that matter most in that scenario are: how quickly does Odegaard rebuild match sharpness after an extended absence? How does the knee respond to the specific physical demands of competitive football rather than training? And does the team, which has been operating without its structural reference point for some time, reintegrate that reference point smoothly, or does there need to be a period of reconnection? These are not dramatic questions, they are precise ones. And the answers will determine how effective Arsenal are in the weeks that follow Odegaard's return. Structurally, the picture for Arsenal has clear shape. If Odegaard returns fit and sharp for Southampton, Arsenal's attacking system regains its third layer. The half-space penetration returns, the pressing triggers become coordinated again. The team that dropped 6 points in his absence becomes structurally a different team, not because of emotion or leadership, but because of geometry. The challenge is the timeline. The run-in is short. Match sharpness after an extended rehabilitation takes time to rebuild, typically 2 to 3 competitive appearances before a player is fully integrated into the rhythm and demands of the system, at full intensity, which means the first fixture or two after his return may not immediately restore Arsenal to their peak structural output, but the trajectory matters more than the immediate result. A returning Odegaard, even at 80%, provides the positional framework that his replacements could not. The system can rebuild around his presence, and as sharpness increases across subsequent matches, the structural output should increase correspondingly. The summer window, meanwhile, will require Arteta to address the dual absence problem exposed by the FA Cup final. Arsenal need a player who can cover the Odegaard function with greater structural reliability than was demonstrated in those 3 matches. Not a replacement, Odegaard is not being replaced, but a genuine alternative. A player whose movement patterns and decision-making speed are calibrated closely enough to Arsenal's system that the third layer of attack does not disappear entirely when the captain is unavailable. That is the next phase of this squad's construction. And the evidence of this season has made the requirement explicit. Here is the most important thing to take from everything we have examined today. Arsenal's problem without Odegaard was never simply a quality problem. It was a coordination problem. The system relies on specific players performing specific functions with specific timing, and when those functions are absent, the coordination breaks down. If not the quality of individual decisions, that distinction matters enormously for how you evaluate this squad. Arsenal are not a team that struggles without talent. They are a team that struggles without structure. And structure, unlike talent, can be maintained, reinforced and evolved through deliberate planning. Odegaard's return restores the structure, but the more enduring question, the one Arteta and the club's football operations team will be examining in detail this summer, is how to build a squad that maintains its structural identity across a full season, even when the players most critical to that structure are unavailable. That is not a problem unique to Arsenal. Every elite team faces it. But it is the problem that separates the teams that compete for titles from the teams that win them. Arsenal are still building toward that answer. The next few weeks will tell us a great deal about how close they are to finding it.